4.5 billion years ago, Earth was a hostile, toxic environment. The surface was dominated by volcanic eruptions, boiling oceans, and an atmosphere of poisonous gas. But early on, a massive collision with a Mars-sized object ejected millions of tons of debris into space. That debris coalesced to form the Moon, stabilizing Earth's erratic tilt and regulating the climate for liquid water. Deep in those boiling oceans, microscopic bacteria consumed sunlight and released oxygen, steadily scrubbing the toxic atmosphere and transforming the sky. As the planet stabilized, complex life scaled up. Apex predators, the dinosaurs, took control of the ecosystem, maintaining a strict biological monopoly for 160 million years. For the first 4 billion years of Earth's history, survival required massive size, sharp teeth, and raw physical strength to endure a volatile, uncontrollable environment. 66 million years ago, a rock 6 miles across slams into the ocean near modern-day Mexico, sending a cataclysmic shockwave radiating across the globe. Plumes of ash and debris block out the sun. Without light, the plants die. Without plants, the herbivores starve, and the apex predators go extinct. But deep underground, small mammals outlast the firestorms and the freezing dark. They eventually emerge to inherit a violently cleared biological slate. Our earliest ancestors step into this evolutionary vacuum. They are slow, lack natural armor, and have no sharp claws. To survive a landscape that still heavily favors predators, they rely on their brains instead of their brawn. Homo sapiens emerge in Africa and soon began migrating outward, walking straight into the freezing, unforgiving conditions of the Ice Age. Look closely at these stones. The sharp, precise chips along the edges show early humans manufacturing the tools and weapons they weren't born with. They also harness fire. It provides crucial heat against the glaciers and wards off predators. But they quickly realize they can use it to alter the chemistry of the meat and plants they forage. By cooking their food, these groups spend less energy on digestion and more on physical development. Over thousands of generations, this consistent caloric surplus supported the evolution of larger, more energy-intensive brains. Gathering around these fires creates tight-knit communities. They share information, develop complex language, and use pigments to paint figures, like this bowl found deep inside a prehistoric cave. They are conceptualizing a world beyond immediate survival. Humanity outlasts the Ice Age because cooperation and tool-making prove highly effective at keeping a species alive. About 12,000 years ago, the glaciers retreat. Instead of constantly migrating to track scattered herds, small groups realize they can plant seeds, domesticate livestock, and let the food grow where they stand. They tie their settlements to the predictable floods of major river valleys to guarantee rich soil. Here, you can see crops thriving along the Nile River, sitting in stark contrast to the completely barren desert directly behind it. By systematically farming wheat and barley, a single acre of land can suddenly support dozens of people. Villages form, human populations rapidly explode. While farming introduced new risks like crop failure and soil depletion, it allowed for the accumulation of stored grain. This provided a caloric insurance that changed our relationship with the landscape, moving us from following nature's rules to attempting to dictate them. But generating a massive surplus of food creates a new logistical problem. You have to store it, distribute it, and protect it from those who don't have it. Managing these massive resources forces small villages to expand into highly organized urban centers. You see the result in the rigid, geometric scale of the ziggurat of Ur, a monument demanding thousands of laborers and a centralized authority. With a surplus of goods comes the concept of private property. Those who control the grain and the fertile land accumulate immense wealth, while those who supply the physical labor fall into a lower working class. To track these mounting taxes, debts, and trade disputes, administrators carve repeating symbols into clay. This is a cuneiform tablet. It functions as a cold, mechanical spreadsheet to manage a rapidly expanding economy. By securing a permanent food supply, early societies accidentally engineer the modern complications of wealth disparity, strict class systems, and heavy bureaucracy. Keeping millions of citizens organized requires absolute authority. Rulers elevate themselves from administrators to living deities, constructing imposing monuments like the Great Sphinx to project undisputed power over their subjects. They also draft strict rules to enforce order. This black stele displays the Code of Hammurabi, an early written legal framework dictating exact, harsh punishments for crimes against the state. When neighboring cities inevitably compete for the exact same river valleys and mineral deposits, conflict scales up dramatically. Look at this stone relief showing a drawn bow and chariot wheel rolling over a fallen enemy. Warfare becomes highly organized and technologically advanced. Humans outsmarted the random brutality of the ancient planet. We survived the ice, we mastered fire, and grew our own food. But to secure those victories, we traded the simple dangers of the food chain for the structured, relentless warfare of empires. Roughly 3,000 years ago, human civilization exploded in scale. Disparate tribes centralized, massive stone cities rose from the dirt, and ambitious rulers began forging the world's first true empires. This period produced some of the most disciplined forces in history: the heavily armored phalanxes of Sparta, the relentless conquerors of Macedonia, the sprawling, highly organized legions of Rome. Looking at this map of the ancient Mediterranean and Middle East, you can see how these empires dominated the known world. They controlled millions of people and commanded vast stretches of Europe, Africa, and Asia. Yet, despite their military and economic power, every single one of these colored borders eventually collapsed. But here is the strange reality of antiquity. Even as their physical territories dissolved, their cultural exports survived. The concepts they engineered simply outlived the men who created them. We still live inside the frameworks they designed. Every time citizens vote in a republic or engineers utilize classical structural principles, we are actively interacting with a blueprint drafted millennia ago. To understand the world we live in right now, we have to look back and see exactly how these ancient powers traded temporary physical conquest for permanent cultural DNA. In the Mediterranean, ancient Greece operated differently than the massive kingdoms of Egypt or Mesopotamia. It was not a single state. It was a fragmented network of independent city-states, each with its own army, government, and culture. That fragmentation allowed for distinct cultural experiments. While Sparta built a harsh military society focused on discipline, Athens experimented with a system where citizens voted on how the government should operate. This environment fostered a new method of inquiry. Thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle used logical observation and debate to identify the rules of biology, physics, and ethics, seeking to understand the world through human reason rather than mythology. By the time Alexander the Great took power in Macedonia, he had been personally tutored by Aristotle. He combined that deep Greek intellectualism with a military campaign that reached the borders of India by the time he was 25. This diagram maps the legacy of Alexander's conquests. His empire fragmented almost immediately after his death, but the ideas he carried did not. Greek language, geometry, and logic radiated outward, blending into the cultures of Egypt, Persia, and India. Greece drafted the intellectual software for Western civilization, but for that software to spread, it required a permanent physical machine to run on. That machine was built in Italy. Rome started as a humble city-state, but through aggressive ambition in engineering, the Romans became the dominant power of the Mediterranean. For centuries, Rome operated as a republic based on written law and shared representation. But immense military success brought wealth inequality and powerful, independent generals. When Julius Caesar declared himself dictator for life, the republic finally buckled. Out of that chaos, his adopted son Augustus consolidated control, launching the Roman Empire. He enforced a 200-year period of stability known as Pax Romana. With internal wars suppressed, Rome poured its energy into infrastructure. They mastered concrete construction, building colossal arenas, deep-water ports, and massive aqueducts that delivered fresh water to urban centers. Their most critical asset was the ground they walked on. Rome paved thousands of miles of fortified highways to move their legions quickly. In doing so, they opened up the interior of the continents to trade. Rome had built a permanent physical network. For the first time, ideas, inventions, and beliefs traveled across the known world faster than an invading army. Traveling along those paved Roman roads was a new force, the expansion of global religion. In the Middle East, the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth moved through the empire's connected urban centers, continuing to grow even when Roman authorities attempted to suppress the movement. Farther east, vast spiritual frameworks were shaping entire societies, providing moral codes that operated independently of military force. Across the Indian subcontinent, complex Hindu traditions had been evolving for millennia. At the same time, Buddhism introduced a methodical approach to peace and the cessation of suffering. Meanwhile, in China, Confucius mapped out a system of social harmony, familial respect, and public morality that organized Asian civilizations for centuries. By relying on shared belief and structured ethics, these religions provided a durable organizational framework. They unified populations across thousands of miles through common values rather than political decree. Physical structures eventually decay. Over centuries, corruption, economic strain, and constant pressure from invading tribes fractured Rome's stability. In 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire collapsed. But the empire did not disappear. The eastern half survived as the Byzantine Empire. Governed from Constantinople, it protected and preserved the legal and scientific records of antiquity for another 1,000 years. While Western Europe fractured, the civilizations of India and China thrived. They pushed mathematics and technology forward, inventing gunpowder and the printing press, sharing innovations across the trade routes of the Silk Road. As this diagram illustrates, the foundational pillars of the ancient world did not break. The concepts of democracy, rational philosophy, and common law morphed into the physical framework of modern society. The empires of antiquity lost their borders, but they left behind their internal logic. The age of legends didn't end, it merely evolved into us. Today, you can pull a piece of glass from your pocket and instantly share data with someone on every continent. We live inside a dense, inescapable web of continuous digital contact. But human geography looked completely different after the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD. The engineered roads and bustling civic centers of antiquity physically crumbled into ruins. Transcontinental trade networks evaporated. Without strong central governments to maintain order, terrified populations retreated behind local fortress walls, establishing the isolated, hyper-local system of agricultural survival we call feudalism. So, how did humanity manage to bridge the dark, violent gaps between those scattered medieval fiefdoms and build the hyper-connected, mechanized grid we rely on right now? The modern world emerged through an accelerating, centuries-long cycle, a pattern of explosive connection followed by devastating global crises that forced the planet to shrink. The map slowly began stitching itself back together along the fringes. In the Middle East, the Islamic Golden Age preserved and traded ancient scientific texts, while far to the north, Scandinavian Vikings constructed swift, shallow-draft wooden ships to aggressively push into new rivers and oceans. Eurasian regional trade zones operated in isolation until the 13th century, when Mongol armies conquered and merged them into a single transcontinental network. But along these exact same routes, fleas carried a deadly bacteria, triggering a massive plague sweeping east to west. The Black Death infiltrated crowded, newly connected cities with horrifying speed. Fever and swollen boils ravaged the population, and the disease ultimately killed nearly 1/3 of the people living in Europe. With the population decimated, the labor of the survivors became suddenly scarce and valuable. This leverage broke the centuries-old grip of feudal lords, ending peasant bondage and redistributing wealth. Combined with the arrival of ancient scientific texts from the East, this new economic mobility fueled the intellectual explosion of the Renaissance. This intellectual revival cured the extreme isolationism of the Middle Ages. People began actively questioning old doctrines and looking eagerly beyond their local borders. That outward push drove European powers across the Atlantic Ocean. This era of naval exploration physically linked the Eastern and Western hemispheres, generating enormous wealth for expanding empires, while inflicting lethal diseases and colonization on indigenous populations. As these oceanic routes matured, the volume of trade outpaced the limits of muscle and wind. In the late 1700s, Britain began replacing manual labor with coal, developing steam engines that physically mechanized the global network, a process that would eventually lead to the invention of the railroad. The same oceanic links that carried cargo also carried illegal pamphlets and radical Enlightenment philosophy. These shared ideas of individual liberty and self-government traveled faster than ever, sparking democratic uprisings like the American and French revolutions. But the system reached a breaking point. Highly industrialized nations, packed tightly into competitive global markets, turned their massive production capabilities against one another. Factories turned out artillery and machine guns, dragging millions of soldiers into the mud for 2 world wars. The race for military supremacy forced scientists to decode the very building blocks of matter. In 1945, the United States harnessed the atom and dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, ending the conflict through absolute devastation. The exact same industrial infrastructure built to efficiently connect and supply the planet had provided humanity with the precise tools needed to destroy it completely. Emerging from the rubble, the United States and the Soviet Union carved the globe into 2 polarized spheres. The Cold War trapped the entire connected world under the constant, anxious threat of a civilization-ending nuclear launch. Because direct combat meant mutual destruction, the superpowers competed through radical technological leaps. They poured billions into rocketry, ultimately pushing human beings out of Earth's atmosphere and walking on the moon in 1969. To calculate those complex orbital trajectories, engineers had to build sophisticated processing machines. The beige desktop computer sitting in a laboratory was a direct byproduct of this aerospace race, inadvertently laying the wiring for the internet and the digital age. Think about the massive contrast. We started as impoverished peasants tied to tiny tracts of land, terrified of the next valley over. Today, we exist as a globally linked species, where information flows seamlessly across oceans in milliseconds. Total connectivity cured diseases, mapped the stars, and shared knowledge instantly. But with a tightly linked global economy and a rapidly warming climate, our survival now depends entirely on how well we manage this singular network we've spent 1,500 years building. For thousands of years, human progress moved at a crawl. Innovations took centuries to spread. Then came the late 20th century. Computers shrank from the size of entire rooms to machines that could sit on a desk. The hardware kept getting smaller until it could be carried in a pocket. When the internet connected those devices, information began traveling instantly. Within a few decades, billions of people were linked together, shifting how commerce, communication, and daily life operated. This rapid acceleration put an enormous amount of power in our hands. We are the first generation capable of editing our own biology and deploying digital technology that can learn and adapt on its own. These tools offer incredible potential. They could cure complex diseases, build sustainable global cities, but they also carry a capacity for destruction at a scale we've never had to manage. Because this transition happened so quickly, we are now building a future that history could not have prepared us for. We are the ones engineering what comes next, and the choices we make today will determine our ultimate destiny. For most of human history, biological fragility was simply accepted as a fact of life. Millions succumbed to ailments that are now easily treatable. Modern medicine, through vaccines and advanced surgeries, drastically extended the human lifespan. Researchers are studying genetic editing to splice out harmful sequences from human DNA before birth. Just as we decode biology, we are building artificial intelligence to replicate our minds. Machines are now trained to process information and generate original text. Automating cognitive work creates vast new challenges. It risks widespread economic displacement as software handles complex tasks faster than a human could. It also opens the door to massive surveillance systems and places enormous decision-making power in the hands of algorithms. Between editing our biological code to augment our bodies and outsourcing our logic to algorithms, we are steadily altering the basic parameters of human life. There are now more than 8 billion people living on Earth. Supporting this population requires immense infrastructure, concentrating millions into towering megacities. Sustaining these cities requires staggering amounts of energy. For decades, power plants have been pumping high volumes of carbon and pollutants into the atmosphere. This steady accumulation is warming the planet, disrupting global weather patterns and driving rising sea levels. While the environment degrades physically, our infrastructure is increasingly vulnerable digitally. Modern conflicts can target a nation's electrical grid through cyber attacks, devastating a society from thousands of miles away without firing a single bullet. And underneath these modern digital vulnerabilities lies an older, purely physical threat. The atomic weapons developed in the 20th century remain fully operational, sitting in silos around the world. Earth is a closed system. If humanity cannot figure out how to manage its industrial footprint and control its destructive capabilities, our own inventions will eventually make the planet uninhabitable. In 1969, humanity briefly left that closed system when we arrived on the moon. It was a massive leap, but progress stalled for decades. Recently, private companies began building reusable rockets. By landing and relaunching the same hardware, the cost of reaching orbit has dropped significantly. This shift in economics has made the colonization of Mars a serious point of engineering focus. But surviving on another planet is incredibly difficult. Mars has no breathable atmosphere, extreme radiation, and freezing temperatures. Deep space is one of the most hostile environments imaginable. We are looking even deeper into the cosmos, scanning billions of galaxies for any sign of life. Finding verified evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence would force a complete rethink of human philosophy and our understanding of our place in the universe. Establishing a multi-planetary presence involves resolving the limits of human biology alongside these technological gains. This is the ultimate evolutionary test, whether our species can survive outside the cradle that created us. To truly understand our current position, we have to look far into deep time. Millions of years from now, geological forces will crack and move the continents, and current species will evolve and disappear. Eventually, the sun will age and run low on hydrogen. As it does, it will expand into a massive red giant, growing so large that it will consume the inner planets, eventually destroying Earth entirely. Push the timeline out to trillions of years, and the universe itself faces an ending. Current models suggest it will continue to expand until the last stars burn out, leaving a cold expanse dominated by drifting black holes. Against this cosmic timeline, all of human history occupies a fraction of a second. We are a tiny species clinging to a solitary rock in a massive, quiet void. The final death of the universe is a physical certainty, but our immediate future remains entirely unwritten. We alone have the agency to decide whether we solve our self-imposed crises or if we disappear quietly into the dark.